With the new decade upon us, we've decided to take a look back at who we think are the greatest Formula One drivers of each decade. Starting off with the 1950s, the decade where Formula One began, the era where the foundations were laid for what would be known as the pinnacle of motorsport. It was an incredibly high-risk sport to be a part of, with a terrifying lack of safety measures, but one man stood out amongst them all. That man? Juan Manuel Fangio. Known as the godfather of Formula One, Fangio was undoubtedly one of the greatest drivers the sport had ever seen. His style, nobility, and awe-inspiring displays of skill were like no other. He was a true gentleman of the sport, humble and seen as a father figure to many of the drivers around him. The legendary Argentine won a total of 5 world championships, a record that was held for 47 years until beaten by Michael Schumacher. In his 51 career starts, he was on pole 29 times and would go on to win a total of 24 races. Fangio also still holds the record for the highest winning percentage at 46.15%. Moving on to the 60s. The 1960s was a golden era for Formula One racing. The likes of Graham Hill, John Surtees, Jack Brabham and Bruce McLaren come to mind, and one man in particular, the late great Jim Clark. Clark won 2 world championships in 1963 and 1965, won 25 races and achieved 33 pole positions, the latter 2 being record breakers that had previously been set by Fangio. Most impressively, however, was that Clark was on pole for 32.5% of his races, with only Fangio doing better. Clark's performance left no doubt in the minds of his rivals that he was indeed the man to beat across every single one of his 72 Grand Prix starts. Alongside his speed, Clark had a rare smooth style of driving that led to him being able to avoid problems in a fragile car such as the Lotus, an absolutely crucial skill that led to his domination of both title seasons. His tragic death in a Formula 2 race in 1968 rattled his fellow drivers. Clark was so good that no one truly thought losing him was a possibility. The 70s were the rock and roll years of Formula One. For us, Niki Lauda is the driver of the 70s decade. He began his career at BRM with some extraordinary performances, earning him a surprise move to Ferrari in 1974 alongside Clay Regazzoni. After one season with the team, Lauda won his first title in 1975 and cemented his position as team leader at the Scuderia. Fans who had seen the Hunt-Lauda movie Rush, 1976 was very well documented as an explosive season filled with battles between the two, ultimately culminating in Lauda's terrifying accident at the Nürburgring, which saw him severely burned and even given his last rites in hospital. Amazingly, just 6 weeks later, Lauda returned to defend his championship lead against Hunt, but at the final race of the season opted out of driving in the rain in Japan, thereby giving Hunt the title. Lauda would go on to win his second title in 1976 with Ferrari, and after a brief stint out of racing would later come back to win his third title in 1984. Lauda's ability to return from his deathbed to win 2 titles is one of the sport's most extraordinary achievements, and certainly another reason as to why he is considered our greatest driver of the 70s. Formula One in the 1980s was seen as the superstar age of the sport. The names Mansell, Piquet, Senna, Prost all slip off the tongue. Whilst it was a close contest for the greatest driver of the decade, the Professor Alain Prost is our man to beat. There is absolutely no doubt that Prost is the most consistent and statistically successful driver of the 80s. In his 6 seasons with McLaren, Prost would go on to win 30 races, 3 world championships and was runner-up twice. His first title in 1985 saw him become the first French world champion, and in 1986 he became the first back-to-back champion since Australian Jack Brabham 26 years prior. His magnificent and bitter rivalry with Ayrton Senna would push Prost's intellect to the test and ultimately would push him into becoming one of the sport's greatest. The Frenchman would go on to win a total of 4 championships and a total of 51 races. For the 90s, there was only one man it could be, Ayrton Senna. Despite his life tragically being cut short at the 1994 race at Imola, Senna's performance in the early 90s set him apart from all. Senna had picked up the new decade where he'd left off the previous, with 2 back-to-back championship wins for McLaren in 1990 and 1991. Senna won a total of 24 races in the 90s, still proving that he had the skill and talent to navigate the new era as technology began to play a crucial element in car performance. Disappointed with McLaren's development efforts with the car, the Brazilian set off to Williams for the 1994 season, the last team he would ever race with. His contributions to Formula One in the formative years of the 90s would lay down a marker to those drivers talented enough to follow throughout the rest of the decade. Only one man would ever surpass it in those early years, Michael Schumacher. Arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest driver the sport has ever seen, Schumacher was already a two-time world champion as he entered 2000, and for the next 5 years he was in a class of his own. 5 successive world titles back-to-back with the prancing horse, Scuderia Ferrari, and complete destruction of record after record followed. Most championships, most wins, and most podiums. The case is already written for Schumacher being the greatest driver of the 2000s decade. Schumacher was absolutely ruthless behind the wheel and a force to be reckoned with in his chase for championship glory. It was unquestionably remarkable witnessing the German achieve new heights and clearly showed the model needed to achieve greatness in the modern era of Formula One. Was there ever going to be anyone else in contention for the 2010s? Of course, it's Lewis Hamilton for our best driver of the most recent decade. Winning 6 championships and a race every year has certainly helped Lewis in his endeavour. Despite being in the most dominant team in the history of Formula One, Hamilton has shown he is head and shoulders above the rest with his ability to drive on the edge, constantly reinventing himself season after season. His extraordinary feat is built on daunting consistency over the recent years, and Schumacher's record is nearing even closer. Lewis has won a total of 73 races in the 2010s decade, and been on pole a staggering 71 times. He has won a race in every season of his Formula One career, undoubtedly cementing himself as an absolute force to be reckoned with. He is in a class of his own, and at only 35 years old, it is clear he is still incredibly motivated and hungry to chase Michael's record of 7 titles. Whilst we wait with bated breath until the 2020 Formula One season begins, it will be fascinating to see which drivers will emerge as contenders for the coveted greatest recognition. Who do you believe will be the greatest driver of the next decade? Will Hamilton continue to dominate, or will we see the likes of Max Verstappen, Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc take charge? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content.